Got it. Okay. All right. Let's go slideshow mode. Look okay?
Looks great.
Cool. Well, thanks, Megan. We'll miss you on the task force here and at these meetings, but looking, wishing all the best for your future endeavors going forward. All right, so I will give the climate rundown over the last month or so here. If you remember back to the meeting in January about a month ago, I think there was a lot of upbeat talk and great optimism, and maybe not quite as much in what we look at here today. Although a mixture of news, I think, in a bunch of different areas. So we'll start with the water year recap. I'm going to show a couple of things from this just because I think it's really cool. It's not even in Colorado, but very close. This is back at the end of January. This remarkable narrow band of snow that formed over eastern Colorado and western Kansas that dumped just huge amounts of snow. This is at Mount Sunflower in Kansas, which is the highest point in Kansas, very close to the Colorado border. Over 2 feet of snow on that day. And I'll show a couple other images from that one, from this storm later on. So it's quite a remarkable thing. Not a whole lot of implications for Colorado water supply, but local drought relief certainly. All right, so we'll kind of walk through the water year so far. So again, remember going back to the start of October. For some of these, we'll go only through the end of January. So the numbers are there for complete months. So here's the national map for January of temperature ranks. And so you can see Colorado in January was above average statewide, but it depends a little bit on where you were, as we'll look at in a moment. Quite warm in the West, relatively cool in the Midwest and the Northeast. So statewide, it was the 39th warmest January. But we go back to the start of the water year, every month so far has been above average with respect to the long-term average. November and December were very warm months, the third and second warmest of those months respectively. And so the water year so far, second warmest October through January. Only water year 2017-18 into January was warmer. And that was not a particularly good year. And so for the water year so far, but 4.5 degrees above the 20th century average, a little over 3 degrees above the more recent 30-year average. And if we look back a little bit further, so this is from the NOAA website, where you can look at like the most recent 1 month and 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, etc. So you see the last 4 months, second warmest in a tie. But if you look at the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months, all of those periods are the warmest on record, going back to the very warm summer and fall that we had in 2021. And again, fits the global trend. So January was the 6th warmest January on record globally. You can kind of see that pattern, not real extreme across North America, warm in the West, cool in the East, but not real extreme either way, but a lot more red than blue on the map, as we pretty much see every month these days. If we look at precipitation, it was fairly dry across almost the whole country, with the exception of some of the Ohio Valley and the East Coast there. But the West was very dry. See California, Nevada, Utah, second or third driest January. Colorado, only the 39th driest January. And so we go back to the water year. October was close to average. November was very dry. December statewide was above average, even though some places were very dry in that period. And then January was below average statewide. So we're 38th driest start to the water year through this point. If we zoom in on Colorado, one of our other sources that we use to get maps like this has been a little bit flaky lately, so we just decided to make our own, and I think they look kind of nice. But it's basically like we just looked at with the rank, but now zoomed in on Colorado and kind of for the gridded data over the state. So this is for January. the blues are colder, relatively cold. The reds are relatively warm in terms of the ranks, and then white falls sort of in the middle of the pack. And you can see that most of the state in January was in that kind of near average range, not especially warm or cold. The main exception being Southwest Colorado, that was quite a bit warmer than average in January. And if we go to the 4 months of the water year so far through the end of January, then the picture does change a bit. Again, second warmest such period on record, and parts of the Eastern Plains were record warm over the first 4 months. And you can see essentially the whole state, well, the entire state being warmer than average, and most of the state being in a top 10 warm conditions for the January through October time period. Precipitation, zooming in on Colorado, a couple different views. This is January as a percent of normal. And so for those of us here along the Front Range, it might look weird to see January being a drier than average month, because for us here locally, it very much was not. It was very snowy, with many places getting, twice to 3 times the normal January precipitation here along the Front Range. The normal January precipitation is not very much, but still a welcome change from the dry fall that we had. You can also see the influence of that snow band that I mentioned out in Kit Carson County, where they had, well over 3 times the normal precipitation in January as well. It was, I'm trying to remember, I think it was it was in the top 10 biggest snowstorms ever for Burlington. I want to say it was like number 3 or 4, but I can't remember the number off the top of my head. But different story if we go to the mountains in the Western Slope. Southwestern Colorado was very dry in January, and most of the mountain areas were dry as well. And so, and some of this, as we'll look at in some stuff I have, and as I'm sure Carl will talk about, a very big start to January, but then not much after that. So we'll take a look at those details in a bit. And here's the ranking point of view for that. So again, like Northern Front Range, top 10 wettest January on record, and similarly out in the Burlington area. But for much of Western Colorado, it was a top 10 dry January, and a couple small pockets here of record dry. And so that averages out to being the 39th driest across the state, but big spatial variations, as we often see. And then for the water year as a whole, this goes back again to October through the end of January. For the water year as a whole, Western Colorado not looking too bad. So the greens here, this is percent of normal. So the greens, is around the average range. Blues, some spots of well above average for the water year, like around Grand Junction. But then east of the divide, still a deficit almost everywhere, with some, pretty significant deficits in Southeast Colorado. And parts of the Palmer Divide area here as well, still quite dry, back to going back to October, really from the extremely dry fall. And here's the rank point of view for that same time period. Again, a pocket of record dry in here, and a lot of top 10 dry over that time period, whereas the west of the divide, it's mostly in the near average to a little bit wetter than average range over this time period, and averages out to the 39th driest statewide for those 4 months. And one other way of looking at this, if you've seen my presentations before, you probably know that I like these plots showing the quadrants of either warm and dry in the upper left, where we don't want to be, warm and wet in the upper right, cool and wet in the lower right, and cool and dry in the lower left. So it's precipitation on the x-axis and temperature on the y-axis here. The averages are shown for temperature to both the 20th century average and then the more recent 30-year average here, which you can see is quite a bit warmer. And then water year 20, so this is for the water year so far, 2022, up here at the top in the warm and dry quadrant, but more so warm than dry. You can see quite a bit wetter than than some of these, very bad years that show up here for the fall and early winter, like 2018, 1981. But it's the, tied for the second warmest over this period, and really mostly bailed out by that huge storm cycle at the end of December, early January that brought a ton of snow to the mountains. And then also the precipitation here along the Front Range that we've had in January. So that's kind of where, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem.
We were looking at this plot last month, and were we more toward the warm and wet since we just had all that beneficial snow? I don't know if you know the answer, but just wondering, are we, moving toward the dry direction?
I'm trying to remember because I think it, yeah, it's hard to remember because the mountains in December were even wetter than they were in January. But of course, everywhere east of the divide was super dry in December, like October through December. So I can't actually remember statewide, but if we looked at it in Western Colorado, it would be in the warm and wet quadrant. And if we looked in Eastern Colorado, warm and dry for sure. And it sort of averages out to be warm and a little bit dry, if that makes sense. I have these for the different climate divisions. I don't have them here in this PowerPoint, but I can point you. Well, actually, if you go to the website there, or I can send them to you. Because I don't remember off the top of my head what they look like, but we've got them.
I see Peter also added in the chat, we were warm and wet in December thanks to those great storms in the mountains around the holidays. This graphic is only monthly, so it's not cumulative. Oh, well, this does say water year through January.
Yeah, this is water year through, this is October through January.
Okay.
So we have both 1 month versions of them, but also these cumulative ones.
And my question is just because it does seem to, never mind that last part, says Peter. It does seem to be one graphic that just somewhat tells us where we are as a whole. And, I think all of us have the sense that we have moved in the wrong direction since the last time we met. And I was just curious if this graphic confirmed that, but.
Yeah, and if we had the kind of this version of the data through the middle of February, it would definitely be moving towards the dry direction. And I have an illustration of that coming up that, at least from a snow perspective, will maybe show that a bit, because the mountains have been very dry in the first half of February. Here on metro area has been snowing all the time, but not so much in the mountains. So I'll get to that bit in a second. But yeah, I think if we had this through the first half of February, it would be definitely moving to the left. Maybe I need to point this way on the video. I don't know how I show up on my screen. It's this way, but for you, maybe it's that way. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, feel free to jump in with questions at any point. And I'm glad to hear that you like these. I don't know. I really like these, but also I'm the one who makes them, so it might just be me that likes them. But I'm glad to hear that at least someone else finds them useful. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.
Okay, so our February so far, through the first, this goes through a couple days ago. Most of the state cooler than normal. Again, these maps are with respect to that 1991 to 2020 normal period. So most places cooler than normal, a few spots quite a bit cooler than normal, like in southern Colorado, southern mountains, parts of the San Luis Valley, Grand County, very cold because they had good snow cover there. Couple pockets warm, like northeast or northwest and southwest Colorado and far northeast Colorado. And precipitation, this goes through the 14th, so it doesn't include the snow that fell last night. And so again, we can see here, especially far western Colorado has been extremely dry. A lot of places with no precipitation in February until they probably got some yesterday. I haven't looked real closely at the numbers out there, but very dry there, and in the mountains, very dry as well. Like, so this is in terms of inches, but you know, 1/10 to 1/4 of an inch in the first half of February is way below normal in, you know, high elevation areas that should be getting like 1 to 2 inches a week during this core part of the snowpack snow accumulation season. So we'll see kind of what, I'm sure Carl will show a lot of what's happened to the snowpack numbers as a result of that. And here's the percent of normal view of that. So very wet along the Front Range, you know, down into the Sangre de Cristos in February, but very dry west of the Divide. You know, only what, you know, 2% or less than 2% of normal. A lot of these places had no precipitation until the last day or so. So not great out there. And here's just the view of the last 48 hours. So basically adding on to what we saw there. So you can see some spots in Western Colorado got, you know, 1/4, 1/2 inch of precip in the last 2 days. But a lot of places still pretty dry. So the color shading here is like radar estimates of the precipitation, and then the dots are from COCORA's observers. This goes through this morning. So you can see again, you know, another you know, 1/4 to 1/2 inch of liquid along the Front Range from the snow last night. Very welcome, very, you know, different story here locally in the urban corridor than what we had at the end of December, obviously. So welcome here, but really we need some more out in the mountains. And similarly, a lot of places on the Eastern Plains have not been getting very much. It's the dry time of year there, but still could use some precip out that way. And then just zooming way back to the very long term, this goes back 2 years. This is the standardized precipitation index going back 2 years, just to kind of show again, in a lot of places in Western Colorado, you know, still in this sort of historic drought in the long term, even though the nearer term conditions, well, or the middle term conditions don't look so bad because the monsoon was pretty good last year, and you know, snowpack is in the average range. But, you know, we go back over the last 2 years, or if we look at the last 4 years, then still some pretty big deficits out that way, as well as some pockets of the Eastern Plains, very dry over that 2-year period, and other pockets of the state like the Arkansas Valley and parts of northern Colorado in the near normal precipitation range over the last 2 years. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit to a few of the stations that we typically look at. Oops, that still says 2021, but should be 2022. I will show you the 2022 data. So we kind of take our counterclockwise loop around the state to some of the long-term stations that we typically look at. Here's Grand Lake. So on these plots, what we have is the water year. The black line shows where we're at the precipitation so far through this water year. The gray line is the long-term, the dashed dark gray line is the long-term average. And then all these thin gray lines are all the individual years from this point forward. And then also like the dashed green is if we went average from this point forward, or above average or above average in purple, below average in orange. I think it's a one standard deviation around that mean, but then you can also see the variability in the distribution there. So Grand Lake, very dry through the fall. We'll see this at a lot of the stations, especially east of the Divide, but also here in Grand Lake on the west side of the Divide. Very dry through the fall, October, November, December, and then a huge jump from like mid-December into the first week of January or so there with that really you know, repeated succession of storms in the mountains. And so that brought things back up to near average as of around the new year, but then not much since then. And so you can see 72% of average precipitation for the water year up to this point. So, and then so then we move over to the west slope to Grand Junction, one of the spots in the state that's actually above average for the water year so far. Similarly, from that December, January period, quite wet at least by Grand Junction standards, during that time. So about 120% of average at this point. But you can see going forward, the July, August, September is really the wettest time of year out there in the monsoon season, and so it's could go any number of ways from this point forward. Conditions stay near average for the rest of the year, then finish in that above average range, but certainly a dry summer could bring well below that also. This is Montrose. This data only goes through the end of January, not through yesterday or the day before, but quite dry there through the end of January, and that's really continued into February so far, so well below average in that part of Western Colorado. But similarly, the late summer into early fall is the key time for precipitation there. So a wet monsoon could make up those deficits, but a dry summer would be not good in that area. And similar picture at Mesa Verde National Park, Southwest Colorado. Same story. November, December, very dry. November, first half of December, very dry, then very snowy through the first part of January, and then nothing since then. So below 76% of average at this point in the water year there. If we move over to the San Luis Valley to Alamosa, it's been quite dry there. They've had a couple of storms recently that have gotten a little bit of precipitation there, but you can still see only 50% of average, 58% of average there. Of course, the average is small. It's both, through this time of the year, most of the precipitation there falls in the summer on average. And obviously it's a very dry place in general. So, but that's where it stands at this point. The fall was also very, very warm in the valley. Go over to Pueblo, made a little bit of a dent in the deficit in the last month or so, but still only 62% of average so far. Similarly, though, the summer is where, it's the big time of year for Pueblo, so that a wet summer or a dry summer will really determine where the water year ends there. Walsh in Southeast Colorado, very dry in Southeast Colorado, less than half of the average precipitation so far. Similarly, the summer is the key month, the key time of year there, but we don't like to see it so warm and dry in that area all the way through the fall and early winter. They should be getting some snowstorms down there, but really kind of haven't, aside from you can see a couple bumps at the end of December and in early February in Southeast Colorado. We go up to Burlington, looks a little better because they were the one of the epicenters of that freak snow band at the end of January. So you can see that big bump there, well over an inch of precipitation in that storm. So they're at 71% of average, not so bad, with the spring and summer months still to come there. And over to Akron, did not really benefit from that snow band, and so remains quite dry in that area. A couple of decent storms in the January, February time period that make things the deficit not so big as it had been, but still quite dry there, with only a little over half of the average going back to October in Akron. And then if we swing over to Boulder, and this is pretty representative of most of the Front Range, where there was essentially no precipitation from October through New Year's Eve, and then we had snow on New Year's Eve, and then it's been snowy ever since. So Boulder, after having record dryness through that first almost 3 months of the water year, is now back at 73% of average, and that doesn't include the snow that fell last night, which would bump that up even a little bit further. So closer to the normal conditions there after a very, very dry start. And obviously we saw the devastating effects of that dry start, but much improved here along the Front Range, at least in the last couple of months, which has been nice to see. All right, so Tracy, kind of coming back to your question, this is a new visualization that we've been working on, and I don't know if it's going to help or not, but I'm going to step through this. Don't pay too much attention to try to pay too much attention to the individual dots here. I'm just going to kind of step through this over the course of the season, and you can kind of see where they cluster together. So what this shows is the y-axis here is elevation. These are the SNOTEL sites. And Carl, you can tell me what you think of this too once we get to your part. The x-axis here is the percentile for that day. So if 50th percentile would be, in the middle of the kind of normal part of the distribution, 0% would be record, percentile would be record dry or record lack of snow, 100 percentile would be record snowpack. And so this is what it looked like on December 7th. This was after that very warm and dry fall, not much snow in the mountains. And the colors here are by basin. So if you're in a particular basin, you maybe can focus on the dots that are for that, the color for that basin. So this is what it looked like on December 7th. And so I'm just going to kind of step through, and it'll show the sort of roller coaster that we've had here in the last couple months. So here's December 7th. December 26th, after the start of that big storm cycle, we went, I'll step back. So on December 7th, there were no stations above normal or above the 50th percentile. 22 stations were either lowest or second lowest at that time. So we go ahead about 3 weeks, and you see it's totally different. Now we got 14 stations above the 75th percentile, and only 3 stations at record or near or second lowest. And then we go to a few weeks later, January 9th. Now all the dots are over on this side with high snowpack as of January 9th, and only a few stations, mostly in the purple dots are the Rio Grande Basin. So they were kind of lagging behind there as of January 9th. And 2 stations, second highest, almost none over on this side. And then we go 3 weeks later or so to January 26th. It's a bit more of a, even scatter, some very high, some pretty low. And then we go to yesterday or the day before, and now a lot of these are shifted back over to the, below average side of the graph. So I'm just going to step through these one more time just to kind of illustrate that. So there's early December, very bad. Late December, early January looking great, late January, and then mid-February where things have kind of regressed back to being below average snowpack a lot of places. So that's kind of the evolution of the snowpack over the winter so far. We've got some interactive versions of these we've been playing with too. So there's a link there if you want to take a look. There's not much description of what it is on the site, but you can like mouse over and see which station is which if you're interested in checking this out, or feedback welcome, because we just started making these in December when we were curious about like how bad it looked. One other thing that Peter had pointed out that's kind of interesting here is that all of the SNOTEL stations at the very highest elevations, which is where a lot of the water comes from, are all in the below average range. Whereas, a lot of the ones that are looking good are in this sort of mid elevation, like 9 to 10,500 feet range. Of course, there's a mix across basins and exactly where you are, but that's one other, thing that this maybe can help point out.
All right, so let's take. Might I ask, do you have an explanation for why that might be, the high elevations being on the lower side?
I don't know if you're there, Peter, you had a good idea about why this was when we were chatting the other day. I think basically just that in the winter, the quote unquote normal situation in the winter, right, is these high elevation stations would be getting snow after snow after snow every week. Even if it's not big storms, they'd just be kind of continuously accumulating the snowpack. But we haven't had those. Whereas I think at the mid elevations, getting 2 huge storms, keeps the snowpack looking good there, like, or 3 or 4 big storms like we had at the end of December, early January. But that's a little bit speculation. We haven't actually looked that closely into this, and maybe Carl will have some insights when we get into more into the snow info.
Okay, thank
If
you.
I
anybody
think
has
that's right, though. I think it's a consistency thing where the higher elevations rely more on a lot of snow events, whereas lower stations you can have above average if you just have a couple really good events.
Thank you.
And I can see that there are chats, but I can't see the chats. So if there's anything relevant, feel free to read it out. Or
You got a couple positive. You got Carl saying, I think these are very interesting plots to have, and Kaylee saying agreed. So maybe Carl will expand on that, like you were saying, when he's done.
cool, thanks. Yeah, there's a group at the Western Regional Climate Center that's made like really fancy versions of these that I think are also really cool, but a little bit hard to interpret also. So may try and grab some of those for future times too. That kind of like goes at a single station, follows the accumulation through the year in kind of a unique way. So we'll keep messing around with that. All right, so let's look at the drought conditions. This is just, again, kind of a fun image back. So this is an image from February 9th, about a week ago. But this is that band of snow that fell on January 25th from a satellite image, extending, partly from close to the Front Range, but then those, 18 to 27 inch totals in this narrow band from Burlington out into Western Kansas that was still hanging on at that point. This is clouds here, so that's not snow. Mountains have lots of snow, but still it's kind of it was a fascinating thing to watch this. This band is now gone finally as of just a couple days ago. So when it warmed up out there, so it hung around for a long time. All right, so new drought monitor just released this morning. This is what it looks like nationwide. I think the Southern Plains is the real area of concern right now, where it's been very dry there, although they're getting some precipitation in spots right now, which is good, and the pattern looks favorable for that area. But some relief in parts of the West, still very bad conditions in much of Oregon and up into Montana. We zoom in on Colorado, here's what the map looks like. So we still have 100% of the state in at least D0 conditions, 90+% of the state in drought, 8.5% in D3, no D4. You can see the D3 is mostly is in the San Luis Valley, especially in far northwest Colorado and parts of the Four Corners and sort of the sliver of southeast Colorado that then gets even worse as you go south and east from there. But much better in a lot of ways since even the start of the water year. We had, say, 15% in D3 and 4% D4 at that point. And that those numbers are reduced, but also more D2 across the plains than we had. So we walk back, this is what it looked like a year ago. So certainly a much better picture now than it was then, when we were still feeling the effects of the horrible summer of 2020 and dry fall and fires and everything else. So some of that has been relieved. This is what it looked like 6 months ago, after we had the super wet spring on the eastern plains, and the drought was alleviated very briefly there, but still bad in western Colorado, with the only some of the monsoon incorporated here as of August. Here's 2 months ago. Looks better on the west slope and much worse on Front Range and eastern plains, leading up to the fire and everything else. And then so here's the change map over the last 2 months since late December. So a lot of improvements here in the Denver Boulder area and up through North Park and northern mountains. From the big snowstorms that happened there in December and January, kind of general improvements across the mountains, again incorporating that big storm cycle. Some improvements in northeast Colorado as well, but now just this week, kind of things are going back in the other direction. This is a degradation this week in parts of the San Juans after the dry month or so that we've had. So there's the current map again. A couple of things to point out in relation to where things stand. This is the evaporative demand drought index, which tries to take into account the atmosphere's thirst for water. This is over the last 2 months. So, from mid-December or so until now. And again, this is of more interest in the summer or the warm season than it is in the winter. But it's still worth noting that Eastern Colorado has had high evaporative demand. And if you go back like to October, November, it looks even worse out there in the fall. And so I think this is an area that hasn't had as much relief lately. They've had some snow, but not a whole lot, and generally warm and dry and sometimes windy out there. So this is an area that I think we're keeping an eye on going forward, mostly for going into the spring. This is the USDA fire potential outlook, and I don't know that much about what all goes into this, but you can see the southern plains, especially where it's been extremely dry, in that above normal potential for grass fires basically in the spring, and also in southeast Colorado. So I think this will be the concern out there if we don't get good snow and rain into the spring on the eastern plains. So that's an area to keep an eye on. Here's soil moisture. This is a week or so old, so again doesn't include the most recent snow here on the Front Range, but you can see, so this is shallower, the top 10 centimeters on the left. This is looking a lot better than it did a month or two ago with some of the recent precipitation, especially on the plains. But the deeper soil moisture, the top meter, still looks quite bad in most of eastern Colorado and parts of the San Luis Valley, some mountain areas. So certainly not a full recovery in soil moisture by any means. And I think that, especially if we look like in Baca County, doesn't look good there in terms of the soil moisture conditions. So need some precipitation in those areas as we get into the spring for sure. And I wanted to just divert for a second. Probably people have seen this paper has been all over the news the last couple of days. That you may have seen. This is an update from a paper by Park Williams at UCLA and others. It's a really interesting approach. So they have tree rings and other paleoclimate proxies that they can use to look at soil moisture, going back centuries. And what they've shown, and again, you may have seen headlines on this, what they've shown, this is a time series of soil moisture from those proxies going back to around the year 800, mega drought in the late 1500s. Basically what they're showing is that this current period in the southwestern US has now become worse than the estimate of that mega drought in the 1500s, and so is kind of the worst drought over this yellow box area in centuries, going back to when they can start making those estimates. And what they find, this is one figure from the paper that shows the observed soil moisture in this 2000 to 2021 period over the Western US, with this really darkest color being the driest on record over that 20-year period. And then on the right is what that drought would, from their calculations, what that drought would have looked like without climate change, essentially. So certainly a very bad drought, no matter, in either perspective, but that's their finding, is that the warming climate is taking what would have been a drought, but not a historic drought, and made it, the worst in that period. And their calculations that like 42% of that difference, or 42% of the influence on that 20-year period was climate change driven. And this aligns with other things we've looked at. I don't know if I've shown these in a while, but it's always good to sort of revisit. This is for Colorado specifically now, showing standardized precipitation index going back to the late 1800s, not back to 800 or anything like that. But you see the wet and dry periods. This is long-term periods of precipitation. You can see we're currently certainly in a dry period in Colorado over the last few years, but not, in terms of just precipitation, not all that much worse than, these historic droughts. But what's happening as the climate warms is then when we add in the effects of temperature here, a proxy for evapotranspiration, it takes, this last 20-year period that had some wet periods and dry periods and just makes it one really long dry period, essentially. And that is consistent with what the Williams et al. Paper found. And another recent paper that is in that same realm, the research on this topic is just really coming fast and furious lately. This is from a group at DRI and UC Merced and other places, looking at trends in evapotranspiration averaged across multiple data sets. And if we focus, so our regions here are sort of in the lower two panels, the Rio Grande region. The trend in ET has been, probably the most stark of any of the regions over the last 20 years. And then the upper Colorado region, similarly, not in the winter, but spring, summer, fall, all contributing to increased evaporative demand in those areas. So I think this is all kind of tying together some of the things that we've been seeing and talking about, but doing the comprehensive analysis of that. All right, so let's take a look forward to wrap up. Maybe you're doing some ski runs and some moguls and trying to figure out where you're going to end up at the bottom of the run there, or watching the mogul skiers in the Olympics. Here's the 7-day precipitation forecast for going through next Thursday morning. Starting to look better for the mountains. We'll have a pretty big pattern shift in the early part of next week. And so it'll at least be more favorable for mountain snow. These aren't big numbers, though, as we look at the departure from average for those. If you look up in the Park Range or the Elk Mountains, even an inch of precipitation over a week can be below average at this time of year. Looks better down in the San Juans, at least as the forecast looks at this point. And then, some additional snow likely along the Front Range here next week, early next week. So what's happened, what kind of, hopefully this tells the story of the pattern that we're looking at. This is for Denver, but it looks similar if you look a lot of other places. Nice warm up into the weekend. So the snow we got last night may well be gone by Sunday, but then a big pattern change with a cold front early next week. Some quite cold temperatures middle of next week, and then a pretty slow warming trend after that. So we're gonna have an extended period of cool conditions into, for much of next week. It looks like after a bit of a warm up going into the weekend. And if we look at precipitation, a couple places, this is Steamboat Springs again. So this is the model ensembles. Every colored line here is a different, model forecast going forward. The gray line here is the climatology, the typical conditions for this time of year. So this is at Steamboat. So we see, uptick in precipitation, still quite a bit of uncertainty about exactly how much there will be. But it kind of looks to me like this will be definitely a pattern change, definitely good snow in the mountains, but not like a blockbuster storm, more of what we should be getting in February more frequently than we have been lately. And if we go to Grand Junction, the lower elevations may, get more than they would normally see in February. And out there, the temperature will be sort of marginal for rain or snow at times, maybe a little bit of each out there. But that's quite a bit above average in the forecast for Grand Junction at this time of year. So going a little bit past that, this is the 8 to 14 day outlook. So this is for February 24th to March 2nd. A bit after that real cold snap, which would be like on the 22nd, 23rd, tilted towards below normal temperatures, and for that period over much of the US. And then after that bit of snow early next week, tilted again back towards below average beyond that. It doesn't look to me like a seriously dry pattern like we've had in early February in the mountains. I think there will be chances for snow through there, but not at least in the next 2 weeks. It doesn't look like we're going to have a drought buster type storm in the mountains, but certainly more snow than there's been lately. And then looking out farther, La Nina is still in place, but it's starting to weaken. The model consensus and forecast consensus seems to be that it's going to continue through the spring, but then transition to ENSO neutral by the summertime. And this is kind of the probabilities here. You see, so the blue is La Nina, and you can see that probability by May, June, July, August goes back quite a bit down with neutral conditions most likely then. And that's sort of what the models show here. This is an average of a bunch of different models that kind of get back to near zero by the summertime. And Peter showed this last time, but it's kind of worth highlighting. The correlation between ENSO and precipitation is pretty weak in the winter, but gets quite a bit stronger in the spring with La Nina favoring dry conditions. And so I think that's a thing that we need to be aware of. La Nina is weakening, so that may be a good sign in that regard. But these seasonal outlooks are still really hard to have a lot of confidence in. So this is what this looks like. So this is ENSO on the x-axis here. So La Nina over on this side, El Nino over here. This is statewide precipitation. In the spring, we'll probably be somewhere in this range. So you can see not a lot of really wet years in that range, but certainly plenty of near average years, but also some very dry years in there. So the correlation, is not that good, of course, between ENSO and spring precipitation, but it does tilt towards drier conditions and increases the risk of dry extremes, especially in eastern Colorado. And so the new NOAA outlooks just came out this morning. So these are really fresh off the virtual press and not haven't had a whole lot of time to look at them yet, but it shows tilt towards warmer than average conditions. And again, I interpret this as like a confidence measure. So the redder the colors here, the more confident that the forecast is that it will be above average temperature. It doesn't really say much about how much above average. It's more about how likely it is to be above average. But we see a tilt towards the spring being warmer than average across all of Colorado, especially the farther south you go. This is mostly that La Nina signal. And precipitation tilted toward drier than average, and especially the farther south you go. So if you look at the pie chart here, I put the dot at Monte Vista just as a one example for the spring. So it shows a 56% chance of being below normal precipitation, about a third near normal, and then only 11% chance of being above normal. So that's relatively high confidence in a dry spring in Southwest Colorado. But again, always take these seasonal forecasts with a grain of salt. All right, so takeaways: recent snow here in the Front Range, very welcome, but the mountains have not benefited much from that since that big storm cycle in late December, early January. The stream flow forecasts are getting worse and worse with time, and Carl will probably talk about that as the snowpack numbers have sort of come back to normal or below normal in most basins. We'll get a pattern shift next week, and the mountains will certainly benefit from cooler conditions and the potential for snow, but it doesn't look like a huge system. And La Nina is continuing, but expected to weaken by summer. But in the meantime, the outlooks are tilted towards a warm, dry spring. So that's what I've got. I probably took too much time already, but happy to take any questions, or I can just respond to questions in the chat too, whatever's easier to keep this on schedule.
Do we have any questions for Russ? I think in the chat, if you just want to monitor that, see if there's anything that pops up, that'd be great. And we'll go ahead and hand it over to Carl.
Will do.
Thanks, Russ. That was incredible.
There,
As
stop
always.
share. Okay.
Now,
All right, I'll try and get, if it's letting me share my screen. Here we go. So I'll start with a quick apology and say my network was down all day yesterday. So this is going to be a bit of a different format. I'm going to try and just work through some of our more interactive products to go through everything today. And I can definitely put something together to post at some point. But I also just follow up. I do think a lot of those percentile versus elevation plots, Russ and Peter, are really, really cool. Do you have those on your website available?
Yeah, I'll throw the link in the chat here. The one issue is that I still haven't been able to automate updating them because of some of the quirks of how your interactive website works, but still working on that. So anyway, but I just updated it yesterday or the day before. So there's the link if anybody wants it.
Okay.
Feedback
Yeah,
welcome.
Thanks so much. I think those are really interesting. It'll be useful for us and also our forecasters, I think, as they try and fine tune stuff. Yeah, so again, apologies I wasn't able to access our standard products yesterday, so I'm going to just kind of do my best to work through some interactive stuff today. But really, most of what Russ discussed, and they look at a lot of mountain data as well, but we've been seeing a lot of the same general patterns at our mountain stations as they've seen in their valley stations from a lot of their main products. But yeah, we'll just kind of go around the state and look at what we're looking at. But there was that, again, obviously that big storm system towards the end of the year, late December into early January, but things have really dried out across the whole state and the mountains since then. So I'm going to kind of just go through snowpack around the state and then precipitation and then reservoirs and stream flows. Just kind of look at what we're looking at. So Yampa White Little Snake, it's definitely really dried out as much as anywhere in the state since that major storm system. Very, very little accumulation, just some little blips here and there, leaving it at, I believe it was 86% of normal. Sorry. This is kind of gonna go counterclockwise here. Colorado headwaters currently snowpacks right at 100% of normal, which is encouraging. I'll get into the reservoir implications here in a little bit, but it's not great, but certainly encouraging compared to the last several years, and particularly in the entire greater upper Colorado basin. We really do need a solid snowpack with current reservoir storages, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. And I think I'm probably going to even just go ahead and not show the graphs because they all look fairly similar. Some basins have had some recent increases. I believe the Arkansas and Upper Rio Grande have done a bit better with respect to snow accumulations since basically the beginning of the year. But in the Gunnison, currently 103% average snowpack, really right on par. But the Blue Mesa is also the biggest reservoir in the state, is currently at the lowest storages since it first filled. There's a blip and an increase over the last month, which we'll take a look at, but that's definitely like a really, really major consideration with respect to Western Slope water supply is the storage in the whole upper Colorado as a whole, which has been, I know I've discussed it in the past, but they ended up pulling water out of Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo Reservoir to help buffer the storage values in Lake Powell for basically to maintain the power supply pool. So all of the storages are incorporated even way downstream from Colorado. On the kind of mid to lower end, we've got the combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan currently have 88% of normal snowpack. And the other plug I'll throw in, I don't know if Brian has done this previously, likely, but we have updated our normals to the 1990 to 2020 period. So a lot of these numbers have shifted, and that was a drier period. The 80s were definitely a bit more wet. So these numbers aren't necessarily apples to apples from what you would have seen last year. So that is also important to consider as we're looking at all of this. And if you ever want to dig deeper, you can always look at the exact station to station values of snow water equivalent. On the lowest end, the Upper Rio Grande is currently 83% of normal. And then the Arkansas, pretty similar, 85% of normal. And as you can see, the Arkansas did get quite a bit more accumulation. And as Russ was talking about, I believe with some of the big storms in eastern Colorado, I'm guessing the Arkansas being on kind of the more eastern end of the mountain zones of Colorado had benefited from that. So the Arkansas really has gotten the most snow accumulation over the last month and a half or so. Then lastly, the North Platte, again, very, very near normal. A lot of these storms have been benefiting the valley zones or along the Front Range, or not necessarily valleys, but the Front Range corridors, but some more steady increases than further in western Colorado. Not excellent, but at least getting some increases at our mountain stations. So moving on to water year-to-date precipitation has been slightly better than the total snowpack accumulation, but not hugely different necessarily compared to what we see in other years. Just with the beginning of the water year starting on October 1st being slightly drier than normal. We've got right at 100% of normal water year accumulation in the combined Yampa White and Little Snake. And the Little Snake goes up into Wyoming, but does contribute to the Colorado watershed in general fairly significantly. It comes down in here and hits the Yampa just before Dinosaur National Monument. And again, hopefully this isn't terribly repetitive, but similar in the Colorado headwaters, 103% of normal. And the water year charts for precipitation really have been following snowpack pretty consistently with kind of those steady increases in the early part. Snowpack would be a little less, but then has dried out quite a bit more recently, as you can see there. And then the Gunnison, just ever so slightly higher, 105% of normal water year precip in the Gunnison, and really following a very similar path. And our combined southwest basins are basically part of the greater San Juan Basin that ends up going down through to Lake Powell at a 90% of normal, slightly higher than the snowpack again, but really very similar. I think it's just a couple percentage points higher. Rio Grande, similar to the snowpack again, is following a very similar pattern, 85% of normal water year precip. Then 92% in the Arkansas. And again, these recent patterns are driven more, obviously more by snow than by liquid precipitation as rain, but has seen more steady increases throughout the new year than really anywhere else in the state. And then the South Platte is kind of in the middle of the zone at 104%, but really aside from our southern basins are generally quite a bit lower, but more closely clustered and near normal than we've seen in the last several years. So we'll move on to reservoir storage. So up in Northwest Colorado, in those combined basins, really not a ton of storage volumetrically in that area, but 79% of normal. So below normal, but not terrible necessarily. And down in the main Colorado headwaters, we are at 82% of normal, which certainly has been a drop from what we've seen. But within a reasonable range, I would say. And I think one of the more, I hate to say concerning, but is kind of concerning areas is the Gunnison with Blue Mesa being as low as it is for folks that downriver folks that use that water. Again, Blue Mesa is at its lowest levels since it filled, I believe in the 60s. And the Bureau of Reclamation has had to manage really the entire upper Colorado system to maintain that power pool at Lake Powell. So that's why those levels are really so low right now, and it'll take quite a bit of snow and moisture to continue to bump Blue Mesa up. And just anecdotally, I drove by it recently, and it's pretty incredible just to see the difference from what we're used to there. So really hoping for as much snow as really this year across the state as we can, but that reservoir storage in the Gunnison is definitely discouraging, and hopefully we can be able to start working that back up over the coming years. And really similar in our combined Southwest basins, not terribly higher at 64% of normal. A lot of these reservoirs are smaller, but still significant and obviously really important for local water users. Going back towards the east and north, things are definitely looking quite a bit better, fairly near normal for right now at 93% of normal in the upper Rio Grande, 92% of normal in the Arkansas. Not terribly off pace, but as we all know, the water supply generally across the state has been kind of rough the last few years. So that it is great to see those near normal reservoir storages. That provides a great buffer for water users. And the highest in the state is the South Platte, and with the recent snowfall out there, hopefully that'll help continue to improve that. So our final section here is the water supply outlook. Starting back up in the northwest part of the state, in the Yampa White Little Snake, very near normal. Again, very, very encouraging for the greater upper Colorado basin at 97% there. Across the Colorado headwaters, again, there's so many sub-basins here. It really affects local water users in a lot of different ways. And we do have tools, if anyone wants to reach out, we do have tools for all of these maps that we're looking at to look at smaller sub-basins. But 96% of normal water supply forecasts for February 1st across the Colorado headwaters. And for folks that don't know, these are generally based on both snowpack and water year precipitation, which are generally near each other this year, but that's largely what these are based off, but our forecasters do look at soil moisture conditions, which in the past 2 years, we've seen some really large discrepancies in soil moisture versus the water supply forecast. So they really do their best to look at that, because with low soil moisture, a lot of the snowmelt runoff does just get absorbed and not ends up making it to a river channel. So just a little more information on what we're looking at. Very similar to the Gunnison, 98% of normal. And this is what we're looking at here again, this is an average of all the combined stream flow runoff forecasts. So it again can vary basin to basin. You can see the Uncompahgre is quite a bit lower. The Uncompahgre at Kelowna, which is near Ridgeway there. Surface Creek, kind of on the north side of the Grand Mesa, is quite a bit higher. So again, if people have particular interest, it is worth looking at the individual points. Unfortunately, some of the lowest in the state are down here in far southwest Colorado, which is really for the last 2 years been consistently the driest portion of the state. Not quite as low of forecasts have we seen, but the total average of all those is 77% of average. And just slightly higher here in the upper Rio Grande, 82% of average. You can see here in the western portion of the basin, kind of the far east San Juans is a lot better, but this whole strip along the Sangre de Cristo Mountains has much, much lower forecasts. Pretty much all below 50% of normal through the Sangres. I don't have New Mexico displayed here, but definitely a pretty dramatic difference west to east across the upper Rio Grande, across the San Luis Valley there. And similar differences in the greater Arkansas, where the headwaters, basically from Leadville down to Salida, have quite a bit more snow and more plentiful forecasts, but similarly, a lot of the lower Arkansas, or just more southern Arkansas, is driven by the Sangre de Cristos, which have much, much lower snowpack. And lastly, the South Platte, not quite as much variation. Average across the whole basin, we're at 100% of normal stream flow forecasts. A little more plentiful in the northern parts, and it kind of fades down to near normal, kind of west of the Denver metro area, and then some of the points throughout South Park are quite a bit less. Similarly, all around 80% of normal stream flow forecasts. But I believe that is all I have. Again, my apologies, my internet and network issues prevented the more traditional presentation, but I'll be able to put that together to post online for folks. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Carl. Okay. Oops. So if there are any questions for Carl, you can put them in the chat. We will move forward with our agenda here into new reports from water providers. I will do just a brief update on other impact task forces. As a reminder, since summer of 2020, the drought plan has been activated, and we do continue to have the agricultural and municipal task forces activated. Those have slowed down just for the winter while we see what's happening here. But the agricultural impact task force will be meeting quarterly is their plan for the year. and the director level drought task force that historically has gotten a monthly update will reconvene in March. So those other task forces are still talking to one another and just slowed down for the winter. So there will be, another drought update, just one pager from this particular task force, which meets regardless of drought plan activation. So let's move on to water providers. Let me see, there's some names I don't know today, which is lovely. And if you don't mind, if you are at your computer and don't mind turning your camera on for an update, that's great. If not, phone is just fine. Let me see if I can organize these names. Okay, Swithin, are you on? Would you like to lead us off? And
Yeah, I am on. Pretty much wait and see mode here for Highlands Ranch. Definitely improving, but our storage is about 40% of capacity, which is lower than average, but not too concerned at this point. Still have March and April to go.
okay. Yeah, and if providers could follow that general pattern, just storage, level of concern, any questions, it's pretty flexible, but that is helpful for us to collect generally. Okay, let's see, Katie.
Hey everyone, I am Katie Mazurowski with Colorado Springs Utilities. Right now, our storage is sitting at about 72% of full capacity, and that's about 4 to 5% higher than normal for this time of year. Again, we're just kind of watching and waiting for the forecasts, and as said previously, we've still got a few months of snowpack, so we're not too concerned at this point, but definitely hoping for some more precip in the mountains.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, what about Jason from Denver Water?
Yes, hey, hi everyone. All right, so we are looking really average, which is great in our collection systems. So on the South Platte, which is 50% of our water supply, we're at 105% in normal. And on the Colorado River, which is the other 50% relatively, we're at 96% in normal. And those actually took a bit of a dip from before, but we are pretty excited at that average. We're not concerned at this point, except for looking at what spring brings us. But right now, our reservoir is at average as far as this time of year. And if we can just get average snowpack moving forward, then I think we're going to be average for the year. So we'll just see. Fingers crossed on spring, but everything is trending in the right direction for us.
It's great to hear. What about John Orr?
Howdy, everybody. Thornton's storage as of yesterday was at, let's see, 70.7% of average, which is a little bit below normal because we've drawn down one of our big reservoirs for a project. We expect to fill, though, with no problem, as long as snowpack holds on. Of course, that's everybody. Stanley Lake is at 79.5% of average, which is a little bit below normal, and but again, depends on runoff. Life is good. Our production is 3.06% year to date above 2021. And so, but at this time, we're not anticipating any drought actions because last year we implemented permanent watering rules, which kind of was our stage 1 and stage 2 of our drought management plan. So that's Thornton.
Thanks, John. Let's see. Eric Jorgensen, do you have any updates?
No updates from us.
Okay. And what about Andy, Anita? I don't think we've met, but do you have any updates for the group?
Good morning. Yes, thanks, Megan. I represent a couple reservoir companies, irrigation companies up here in Larimer and Weld counties. And our current storage is about 75% of capacity and 122% of average for this time of year. So we're sitting reasonably well. Enjoyed all the presentations this morning. I'm a little bit particularly concerned about the forecast for the dry spring, March through May. That's typically when a lot of things start happening. So as of right now, we're sitting in a pretty good position. And again, if we can kind of get to an average runoff, that would make our year look pretty good. So thank you, Megan.
Yeah. And what organization?
It's Larimer and Weld Irrigation
Okay.
Company.
Thank you. Okay. Let's see, I'm trying missing things. I have to jump between names. Chris Wolf, do you have any updates?
Hey everybody, up here in Vail, Colorado. Yeah, we are excited that we are at 103% snowpack up here in the basin, kind of the headwaters of the Colorado. However, we are concerned if things don't improve, obviously like maybe everyone else, that we're going to have some, we're going to have some summer issues. So we're really trying to get ahead of the game, a lot of communication outreach. Reservoirs are doing okay. All in all, just trying to dance for as much snow as possible.
I like that approach. Beverly Richards.
Hi, I'm with the Upper Gunnison River District in Gunnison, and you've already heard part of our story. The storage in the Upper Gunnison, in the Upper Basin, is at 42%, and that's using Taylor Park Reservoir and Aspinall and the Blue Mesa. However, we did get a prediction February 1st from the forecast center saying that Taylor Park may fill to 93%. So we're encouraged by that. But that definitely could change if we don't get some more snow.
Thank you. What about Chuck Weiner? Or John Crawford?
Good morning. Yes, this is John Crawford from the city of North Glen. And I would say we are anxiously optimistic about our reservoir filling. We're at 103% of average for this time of year. So no concerns at the moment. And we're not, I would say compared to last year, we're not putting the wheels in motion for drought declarations quite yet.
Okay, thank you for that update. Josh Nims with Westminster.
Hi, thanks for the meeting. Similar to North Glen and Thornton, we're looking pretty typical in Stanley, and our storage is about 85% and monitoring still, but no initial plans on any drought. Thanks.
Thank you. See, and then I'm just going to open it up. I've got some names that I don't have associated with any particular entity, so please feel free to unmute yourself with an update from your location. Rob Harris, do you have any updates from CPW?
Thanks, Megan. Not today. Pretty quiet season for us. We had a lot of fishing closures, of course, last year, but those happily are all gone away, and we're just monitoring like everybody else. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I'll hold for a little bit longer if anyone else wants to chime in here. Okay. Well, those were really helpful presentations. This has been recorded and will be posted on the CWCB Water Availability Task Force website, along with presentations and update as normal. So thank you for joining today. That is all we have. And if you have other questions, feel free to follow up as always. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Megan.
Thanks.